Hey nerdy knitters, in this video we're going to look at top-down shawl construction. We'll look at the basic construction method, which is worked. You start here and you work increases along the edges and along the center to create this triangle shape. And we'll also look at how you can take that basic shape, change your rate of increasing to create a heart-shaped shawl instead. But before we do that, I just want to say, hey, I'm Tanya. I'm a knitwear designer and a certified knitting instructor with the goal of helping you become a confident, adventurous knitter. And one way we can do that is by learning all about this construction method, so you'll be able to follow any top-down triangle shawl knitting pattern or even design your own. There's also a printable that goes along with this video if you want to print it out. You'll find a link for that down below. Or you can Google Tanya Knits Resource Library. You'll go there, fill out the form, and have access to the library and be able to download this printable and use it today. And if you want to jump to any point in the video, there are some timestamp links down below as well. So let's look at how triangle shawls are constructed. Here's our basic little shawl. It starts out right here. You work something called a garter tab cast on, which we'll discuss today. And then you pick up stitches and you start working this way. You can increase right here along the edges and along that spine. 4 increases total on the right side rows, and it creates these 2 triangles that form our shawl shape. You work as long as you want, and then you can bind off along this edge. Now you can see on the printable the same thing right here. We cast on at the edge, right here at the top, and then we work our increases at these points to create the shape. And there's some instructions here for working that. But before we do that, we have to start with our cast on. And we start with something called a garter tab. And that fills in this spot right here. You can see in this sample, I did not use a garter tab. And there's a big empty space right there, which is fine. Nobody really sees it. It could be a place for your neck to sit while this is around your neck. But a lot of the times we just don't like that empty spot in there, and we want to fill it in with something called a tab. Like this shawl right here. I did work a tab. And since we're working in garter stitch, we work a garter tab. They can be worked in other stitch patterns, but a garter tab is probably the most common. So this top-down shawl starts with that. Okay, so this shawl starts by casting on 3 stitches. I want a 3-stitch edge along my shawl. That can be adjusted, of course. We'll discuss that in the garter tab video. But I'm going to cast on 3. I use a backwards loop cast on here because it's the least likely to give you a bulky seam along that edge when we pick up stitches. Once you've cast on, you're going to knit 6 rows. There, I've knit 6 rows. If you're not quite sure, just look, you should have 3 garter ridges. We knit 1 more row. This is row number 7. And we turn our work. Okay, so this tab fills in that spot right there. We've started it. The 6 rows is the tab. Now we're working our first 3 edge stitches. We're going to pick up some stitches here to create the body of the shawl, and then we pick up stitches along our cast on edge to work the edge stitches in that direction. That's what a tab does. It fills in that spot right there. So we have our 3 from our row 7. We've got our 3 stitches for one side of the edge. Now we're going to pick up 3 for the body of our shawl. And we do that in the garter stitch. You do it by picking up the garter bumps right here. Now it doesn't matter. You can pick up the ones right along the edge right there if you wanted to, or I just prefer to pick up the bumps right here on the top, just like this. Whichever one you do, just make sure you're consistent and you pick up 3 the same. There's those 3. I'm not going to put them right on my needle. I'm going to knit into them just as if they were knit stitches. And that gives me 3 stitches to start the body of my shawl. We have our 3. Now we need to turn our work and pick up stitches along the cast on edge. Now this can be a little difficult. Just get your tail out of the way, but nobody's really going to see this, so it doesn't have to be exact. Just look for 3 spots along that cast on edge that look like they would be not too conspicuous. I'll pick one up right over here on the edge. And one right here. And one right there. This is why I prefer a provisional cast on. It makes that part a little easier. I'll link to got a full video just on the garter tab cast on, and I use a provisional cast on for that. So there we go. We have 3 edge stitches, 3 edge stitches, and then 3 stitches that will help us start the body of our shawl. 1 for the center spine, and then 1 for each of those smaller triangles that make up the shape. Once you have that complete, you can start with the instructions in the setup row, and that's on our printable here. I'm going to knit those 3 edge stitches, place a marker, increase, I'm just going to use a yarn over, knit 1, yarn over again, place another marker, knit that central spine stitch, place a marker. Those markers keep that spine stitch separate. Increase, knit 1, increase, place a marker, and knit the other 3 edge stitches. That is our setup row. As you can see, there's that top of the shawl right there. That's where it would sit. And we start working out from there. Now if we look at it that way, we can see that we've got our edge stitches over here, and then we use these markers to remind us to increase, but also it keeps everything separate. Between these markers here, we've got our body stitches. Now we're up to 3 on each of those triangles. And then there we've got our central spine stitch that stays in the middle. Now your next row would be a wrong side row, and you can decide at this point, what background stitch do you want it to be? Do you want it to be worked in garter stitch, like this one? Or do you want to work in stockinette? Or you could even add a stitch pattern. You'd add it somewhere in that triangle shape on each side. So I've got notes about that. If you're going to do garter stitch, you would just knit to the end, like I'm going to do on this row. So I'll knit to the end and we'll get back to our right side row after. There, I finished my wrong side row, working in garter still, and then our right side rows are just like the setup row. We work our edge stitches, we're working in garter stitch, so we knit every row. Slip that first marker, we increase, work to the next marker in whatever stitch pattern we've chosen. We increase again, slip the marker, work that center spine stitch, slip the marker, increase, work the body stitches on this side, increase, slip that last marker, and work the other edge. And that's all there is to it for this basic shawl shape. You keep repeating those 2 rows. That's the row you would work on the right side rows, and then your wrong side rows you would knit if you want it to work in garter stitch. You would purl out, well, you would knit your edge stitches and then purl the other stitches if you wanted it to be in stockinette. Or if you wanted to add some other stitch pattern, you could work eyelets right there, just a simple knit 2 together yarn over. You could add a cable to the center spine, increase a few more stitches right there and work your cable. Or you could add a stitch pattern. Here's a chart. This is what this type of shawl would look like if we were to chart it out. It looks a little confusing, but just remember that those gray no stitch means there's nothing there yet. They're just placeholders. If we were to cut this out and tape these pieces together and get rid of that gray, you would see that shawl shape. You can see the 2 triangles here. Each side of the shawl, there's our center spine, and there's our edge stitches worked in garter stitch. So if we wanted to add a stitch pattern to this, we would plug it right into here on each side. So if you have a cable pattern or a lace pattern, you could chart out this shawl and add it right in here. You could also adjust things, like in this shawl, when I did my garter tab cast on, I cast on 1 stitch for each side of the body, but I cast on an extra stitch in the middle so I could work a little cable right there. And that's easy to adjust. I've got instructions for that all right in the printable. Now before we get to the next part where we look at heart-shaped shawls, I just want to pop back in here and say, be sure to leave a comment down below if you have a question about how this type of shawl is constructed, or if you have a tip to share that would make working this type of shawl easier to do. Don't forget to grab your copy of the printable, and be sure to subscribe if you like to get nerdy with your knitting. Now let's look at this heart-shaped shawl construction. Now here's our heart-shaped shawl. This one I used an I-cord edge. There's also an I-cord tab that you can start with right here and keep that I-cord edge. I'll link a video for that. But this shawl actually uses the same basic construction. We have our center spine, we have our edge stitches, and we have our 2 triangles, but they are shaped a little bit differently, right there. Our right side rows are worked exactly the same, but to get these little wings, we're going to add a new step. On the wrong side rows, you're going to work your 3 edge stitches, slip your marker, increase on your wrong side row, knit to the final marker, and increase again. So on the right side rows, you're increasing 4 times along your edges and along the spine. And then on the wrong side rows, you're increasing again on each edge, and that gives you those extra stitches that form this little curve right here. This shawl shape really sits nicely around the shoulders. I like to add those little tips. And when your shawl is as large as you want it to be, you can bind off with a stretchy bind off. Now that you know how this basic shawl is constructed, you can add some variety to it by adding some color with stripes, wide or narrow, adding some cables or lace, or even just simple yarn overs across the row to create eyelets, or those extra increases along the edges to create the wingtip shawl. There's lots of things you can do with this construction method. There's some tips in the printable that will show you how to add some extra stitches to your cast on, or some tips to add some variety if you just want to start knitting one today. Be sure to get your copy of the printable. You'll find the link down below in the video description box, or Google Tanya Knits Resource Library and follow the instructions to gain access there. See how this construction method works in various designs. Check out the video I've linked here. It shows 10 different shawls, all using this same construction method. And if you like to get nerdy with your knitting, be sure to subscribe.